Chapter 7. Leaving the ruined city behind, they climbed up into the foothills, the mountains looming ahead as the city shrunk further and further into the distance. They paused at sunset, watching the great orange orb cast its final long shadows across the vast plains that rolled out below them. They gave a shudder when thinking about what had happened among those crumbling walls just a few hours earlier. The sky turned a deep blood red as the sun dipped lower and lower below the horizon. Normally, they would have already stopped and made camp for the night, their mouths watering at the smells of roasted meat. They pushed on through for a few more hours, wanting to put as much distance as possible between them and that cursed place they had left behind. As the sky faded from navy blue to black, the stars twinkling in the heavens, the mules finally stopped in mute protest, refusing to go any further. Dismounting, they led them to a small copse of trees and tied them up, making sure they had their fill of water and grain before looking to see what they had left for themselves. Their rations were starting to run low, and Hitch knew the foraging would be more scarce the further they ascended. They would need to push hard tomorrow if they were going to make it over the mountains into the plains beyond. Sitting in silence while they munched on their meager meal of dried fruits and nuts, they heard something off in the near distance. The wailing moan trailed off. Hitch and Cielo froze for a moment before fumbling for their weapons. They turned around, trying to ascertain where the sound had come from. And they started to head toward the source of the noise, ducking low and holding their crossbows at the ready. Edging up to some bushes, they readied themselves for anything. Pushing some branches aside, Hitch noticed an odd rock formation. A very large boulder had been placed near a dark, gaping entrance cut into the side of the hill. The entrance had carved support beams on either side, holding up a crosspiece. "It's the wind," Hitch chuckled to himself. Cielo turned to face him as he went on. "Just the wind. Nothing to fear. Coming out of that entrance up ahead." "What do you think it is?" "Possibly a mine entrance of some kind." "I don't want to find out," Cielo declared as she gripped her weapon tightly. "With the way this weather is rolling in, we might not have much of a choice." He pointed up to the sky where large dark clouds raced along, blotting out the stars as lightning flashed inside the puffy pillows of water vapor. Her fear forgotten at the thought of having to sleep outside in the pouring rain, they made their way back to the caravan to fetch their hand weapons and secure some additional armor. "I'll take this in a tunnel fight over almost anything else," Hitch whispered as he tapped a finger onto the flat of his axe blade. It seemed to glow in the soft white light of Solinardi. Cielo pushed her arm through the straps of her buckler, flexing her bicep to ensure it was in place, before drawing her short sword and nodding to Hitch to lead the way. They had managed to light a torch with flint and steel. The old rags at the end of the stick leapt to life as they ignited. Holding it out in front of him, making sure to hold it as high as possible out of his direct line of sight, Hitch and Cielo made their way into the carved stone entrance. Squeezing through the gap where the boulder had shifted away from the entrance it had been intended to seal, they stepped over the threshold as the rain started to pour down. They made their way along the tunnel, weapons at the ready. The passage was lined either side with large rectangular stones, the size of loaves of bread, which were perfectly laid on top of each other, the joints so smooth and close they could detect no mortar had been used or needed. An archway appeared ahead, the light of the torch unable to illuminate the darkness beyond. Stepping closer, they realized a long set of steps disappeared down into the pitch-black depths. Hitch held up his arm, signaling not to proceed. Handing the torch to Cielo, he fumbled in his pouches until his hand emerged holding a small square of some kind. Cielo tried to lean in closer to find out what he was doing, and almost touched him on top of the head with the burning tip of the torch. "Damn it, girl, just wait a second." Taking her wrist, he pushed it up as high as his arm could reach and gave it a little shake to indicate she should hold it in place. Stooping down, he fumbled for the square he had dropped until he stood up and plucked Cielo's crossbow from the hook on her belt. "This here," he held up the square, "is an old piece of map I haven't had a use for since long before you were born." He stuck it onto the end of a bolt before clamping it between his teeth while he wound back the action. Hearing the click, he took the bolt and tried to hold the tip up to the torch. Cielo pulling away before he waved his hand towards himself. Unsure of what was going on, she dutifully lowered the flame until the parchment caught. "And this," Hitch pointed the crossbow down to the distant bottom of the stairs, "is why you should always avoid going underground wherever you can." The paddle trigger clicked, the bow limbs jumped, and the burning tipped bolt shot down into the darkness like a shooting star. Whoosh! The burning paper was a foot from the floor when the world below caught on fire. The air burst into a bright blue flame that rolled out in all directions as a clear lake when a stone is dropped into it. A wall of hot air shot up the stairs in an instant to buffet weakly against the pair, who raised their arms to shield their eyes as they turned their heads away on instinct. They looked back down, and the bottom of the stairs was pitch black again. No sign was left that moments earlier an azure inferno had seemed to consume the entire floor below. "Call me a kenda. What was that?" Cielo practically shouted. "Heavy air," Hitch stated matter-of-factly. He was going to leave it at that before he caught the expression on her face, the same exasperated one that she would give, usually followed by a comment to the effect that his answers were as short as his legs. Taking the torch from her, he began to descend the steps as he continued his lecture. "A gnome tried to explain it to me once. They said there are many different types of air, which while we cannot see, we can feel them as the wind. Some of this air is heavy, though how such a thing can be true, I do not know, and it sinks to the floor. Now in caves and mines, where there is precious little breeze at the best of times, this air sits in a pool, as it were, waiting for the touch of a spark to burst into flame. Worse still awaits the unwary, who breathe in this heavy air that poisons the body and brings low the most able of men." Cielo considered his lecture for a moment before responding. "You were talking to a gnome?" she asked in mock surprise. "You know damn well no one ever talks to a gnome. They simply talk at anyone within earshot." While descending the stairs, Hitch noted the brass rings, wider than a clenched fist, that stuck out from the wall periodically, and mused they must have been part of a handrail at one time. Whether they supported wooden rails turned round on a lathe, or links of a chain, no trace now remained. This would indicate that whoever had built this structure had abandoned it quite some time ago. From one ruin to another, Hitch thought to himself as they approached the final few steps. He paused to hold the torch out in front of himself at head height, waving it back and forth slowly. "What in Kryn are you looking for?" Cielo asked as she tried to peer past him. "Perhaps there are some man-made chaps to go with the naturally occurring ones. Do me a favor and take a step down. I want to test a theory." Cielo shoved Hitch playfully from behind and he almost toppled over. "Hammer and tongs, girl!" A most powerful of profanity for any who have made their living striking hot steel. Arms waving in circles, Hitch managed to right his balance before Cielo leapt past him, sailing through the air to land at the bottom of the steps. He flinched before freezing in place, hoping a trapdoor would not suddenly give way and swallow her whole into the darkness beneath. Shrugging her shoulders, she snatched a torch from his hand before she turned on her heel and headed off down the corridor. Tripwires are no ebony vipers, but they hold surprises just as deadly for the unwary. Hitch called to her back before he hurried to catch up as he found himself being left behind in the enveloping darkness. The walls of this corridor differed from anything they had encountered earlier. While the stone was laid with the same great craftsmanship of a master mason, shallow recesses had been chiseled into the stone, wider than they were tall. Into these recesses, decorative mosaics had been inlaid to give the impression that one were looking out a window at some beautiful and majestic vista. They stopped to stare in wide-eyed admiration at the scenes of rolling farmlands, sweeping valleys, and wind-swept snow-capped peaks. Who would make something like this? Cielo asked. Mountain dwarves. Hitch answered solemnly. Confining themselves to living underground for the most part, this would have been the only way they could have seen the outside world and remember what it had been like. Hitch rubbed a thumb across one corner of a mosaic, cutting a channel through the dust that had been gathering for untold years. "Where did everyone go then?" Cielo asked, with a wary tone, afraid of a sinister answer. "Many places were abandoned in the cataclysm. Those terrible earthquakes would have shaken anyone dwelling here like dice in a cup." They started to continue further down the corridor when Hitch remarked, "It reminds me of the old joke that during an earthquake, every coffin must sound like a dried seed pod." Cielo stopped and turned to Hitch before he held up his hands and mimed as though he was holding something horizontally between them before shaking them in time back and forth. Chicka, chicka, chicka. The sound hissed between his teeth before he burst out laughing at his own dark humor. Taking back the torch, he started off down the corridor, leaving Cielo stunned and horrified for a moment, with the mental image of dancing bones in her brain, before she hurried after him. They could no longer hear the rain outside, so deep were they now underground. Moving forward, they came upon recesses cut deep into either side of the corridor that ran from floor to ceiling. They crept forward, expected something to jump out at them. Readying their weapons, they leapt forward as one, each turning in the air to face their assigned recess, where they almost struck down the figures standing before them. Halting their killing blows at the last moment, they realized their opponents were statues. They had been elaborately carved with the keen eye and steady hand of dwarven craftsmen. Leggings peeked out from beneath long mail shirts to be tucked into boots that gave the appearance of the soft leather they sought to recreate. Deer horn handles protruded from scabbards held by thick wide belts which threatened to be overhung by the long braided beards of the solemn stoic guardians that had kept their eternal watch. Traces of paint could be seen where once thick bright coats of colour had been liberally applied from helmeted head to toe. When the collection of artists that had breathed them into life had finally stepped back to admire their creations, anyone would have been hard-pressed to tell them apart from a living, breathing dwarf at more than 20 paces. "Truly amazing," Cielo said as she studied the statue before her. "You'll get no argument from me, little one." Hitch spoke with a great deal of pride, for even though this was a fractious people who held grudges as a dragon hoards coins in its lair, the one thing all dwarves could agree on was their superior skill in any craft they turned their hands to. "About the only time you won't argue," Cielo flashed him a cheeky grin. He cocked one eyebrow, trying his best to stare her down, a task made all the more awkward by the fact that he had to look up at her in order to do it. "Now, if you've finished practicing your award-winning charm, how about we find out where this corridor leads, hey?" Simply nodding her head in agreement, she fell in behind Hitch as they continued on, leaving the Eternal Guardians alone in the darkness. Living eyes might never look upon them again, yet continue their silent vigil they would. "Looks like a big chamber coming up." Hitch called over his shoulder. A few more steps and they were at the threshold. Hitch held up his axe to signal Cielo to come to a halt. They paused to listen, hearing nothing but the sounds of their own breathing. "We go on 3, 2, 1. They burst into the chamber, weapons at the ready, the torch held high, cast flickering shadows against the walls. They were in a domed chamber with a ceiling so high the light from the torch could not penetrate it. Corridors led away in other directions. At least they would have if their entrances were not blocked by fallen rubble. Recesses cut into the circular wall, taller than a human, held statues of stern dwarven warriors. Dressed in full suits of armor, adorned with elaborate carvings and details that made the guardians they had left back in the corridor look like the work of an amateur apprentice by comparison. Horned and riveted helmets sat on their heads, while swords, spears, and axes were held at rest. Hitch turned in place, holding up his torch to examine each of the guardians in turn. The torchlight cast them in deep shadows, their features appearing cruel and menacing. Cielo could very well imagine them stepping forward from their recesses, raising their weapons to cut them down. She backed away from Hitch, moving toward the door, when she heard the popping hiss of the torch dying out. "No, no!" Cielo screamed as Hitch whirled around, catching her wrist and pulling her close. "Easy, girl, easy. Open your eyes now. It's okay." Slowly opening her eyes, she saw the entire chamber was now cast in a soft green illumination. Looking up, she found where the source of this strange new light was coming from. "Glow moss," Hitch said. "I have not seen it in many years. It is quite rare. But the moss will glow with a light of its own. Gnomes have been trying to replicate it for centuries. Look at the statues now." Turning, she saw the statues cast in the green glow appeared calm and serene. "Elders," was all Cielo could manage to whisper in awe. "They are that, girl. Dwarven elders left to guard this place for Rerox knows how long." The recess directly opposite the tunnel entrance was not like the others. It was wider and shorter. The figure sitting on a throne with a huge smithing hammer resting against one leg. The hammerhead was turned sideways, the handle pointing up to the dome ceiling. "Rerox!" Hitch exclaimed in awe as he identified the idol of his god before him. Dropping to one knee, he bowed his head. Cielo raced over to join him. "Oh, great father," Hitch began, his words failing him. Tears began to form in his eyes as he felt Cielo's arm wrap around his shoulder. "I would tell you what we have been through, but you already know. I would tell you what we need, but a good dwarf never admits to needing anything." Rising to his feet, he walked toward the sitting idol, his hand disappearing into his clothing, to emerge holding a thin silver ingot. He placed the small metal bar onto the idol's knee, letting his hand linger for a moment. "What is a smith who does not have metal to work?" He paused for a moment, staring at his offering. "All right, enough of that then. Let's build a fire and get something cooking already." They then proceeded to argue about the fate of their loyal mules, Hitch refusing to bring them into this most sacred of shrines where they would be free to leave their droppings. Cielo countering passionately about leaving them outside in such terrible weather. Hitch ended the matter, telling her that mules had done so long before dwarf or human had ridden them or hitched them to a caravan, and somehow they had gotten along just fine and could do so for another night. After they had gotten a fire started, their thoughts soon turned to what they would have for dinner, their stomachs dissatisfied with the meager rations they had consumed earlier. They returned to the caravan, where they gathered their supplies, checking on their mounts, who sat with heads bowed under the protection of the trees they were tied to. Upon their return, water was brought to the boil, spices tossed in as the aromatic smells filled the air. Hitch unwrapped a waxed paper package, pulling out some small, smooth brown bricks that looked for all the world like bars of soap. Dropping them into the water, they soon began to dissolve into beef stew. "What I wouldn't give for some buttered bread right now," Hitch said as he closed his eyes and savored the smell of their meal. "Don't forget a good mug of buttermilk," Cielo joined in, their eyes met, sharing a knowing nod. "Hitch, why don't people believe in the gods?" Cielo's question caught him off guard for a moment. Hitch paused for a moment as he gathered his thoughts. "If you drop a bucket into a well and it never comes up with water, would you believe that wells never contain any?" He put the question to his young charge. She looked to the floor for a moment, her brows knitting together. "No, because wells have water." Cielo was confused for a moment, thinking back to the well near their home and the plentiful buckets of cool, fresh water she withdrew every day. Some days she had wished it would run dry, if only so she could take a break from heaving and pulling on that rope. "Yes, you know water is in the well because you have seen it. No one has seen the waters, though, since the cataclysm, and must rely on the written words of those long dead that water ever existed in those wells. This is like the existence of the gods. Our temples like this one here that we sit in are the wells which remain dotted across Krynn. Our prayers being answered is the water we draw from them. I have faith that one day the waters will return. Just because our prayers are not answered does not mean they are not heard." Turning his head, he looked up to the great idol of rear rocks looming above them. When we are children, we ask our parents for everything until we are adults and must do everything for ourselves. The races of Kryn are now grown and must look after themselves until their parents return. Even when they are not around, we know that our parents still love us. Cielo nodded her understanding, her eyes wide with the revelation. I wish our parents would return soon then, she remarked as a look of sadness crossed her face. The memory of her own parents had already begun to fade, their faces blurring in her mind's eye. It saddened her that one day she might not be able to recall what they looked like at all. Here, eat this. He handed her a bowl of the hot steaming stew. Suddenly she remembered how hungry she was, dipping in her spoon and blowing until it was cool enough to taste. Filling their bellies, they were soon stretched out on the stone floor, warmed by the fire's glow, and snoring their heads off as the troubles of the past few days melted away.